I know that we are doing Boys in the Valley as the current August Two Friends Horror Book Club book. I have been told to let you guys know that we will not be giving any spoilers at all. So, get that out of the way.
Yeah.
So, I'll just start this off by saying, for those in the room who are not acquainted with the book yet, how would you describe Boys in the Valley?
Right, good, on, yeah. Thanks, guys, for coming, really, really super appreciate it. We just drove in from Tulsa this morning, so excited to be here. So Boys in the Valley is about, it takes place at the turn of the 20th century. It's majority of the book takes place in 1905, and it is about a group of orphans who live in a remote rural orphanage in Pennsylvania, and they're kind of cut off from the rest of the world, and it's run by these Catholic priests. And they have a very difficult life. It's a very hard life. They're very poor. They don't have enough to eat. They have to everything they eat, they sort of have to work the fields themselves for, and they have to work the animals. And so, and they're all have very, difficult pasts, and the discipline in the orphanage is very strict and sometimes a little over the top. So, so these guys have hard lives. And one stormy night, as it were, this is not a spoiler, there's a knock on the door, and the sheriff from the next town over is there with a man with a sack over his head and who's bleeding profusely and is badly injured, and the sheriff is like, can you save this man's life until we can get him back to the town and deal with what he's done. The man ends up not surviving in a very dramatic fashion, and whatever evil was inside of this man is released into the orphanage, and some of the kids are infected or infested with this evil, and some of the kids are not. Cue snowstorm, which basically makes this little orphanage sort of this hot box of horror and violence and mayhem for the remainder of the book, as the kids figure out whose side is who on, and what ultimately are the goals for each of the different groups. So that's kind of the nutshell of what the book's about.
All really normal human things to think about and write about. So that leads to my next question: how in the ever-loving did you come up with the idea? What was its inception like? How many test subjects did you have to
Right. Yeah, so I was I still do write screenplays, but around a decade ago I was writing a lot more screenplays, and I was kind of hunting for ideas, and I had been pitching different studios like Blumhouse and CBS different ideas, and so I was just kind of like researching, and I came across this article about these kids in an orphanage in rural Pennsylvania at the turn of the century who had vanished. More than half of the kids had basically disappeared. And when there was sort of like a wellness check or whatever, the priest didn't really have great answers as to what had happened to the children, and the children were never found, and the orphanage was shut down, and the kids were sold to factories and stuff like that. And so that was kind of like, oh, that's interesting. And I really wanted to write about what I thought happened at that orphanage. And so that was how the original idea came about. I wrote the idea as a screenplay, and then about 4 years ago now, I guess, decided to adapt my own screenplay for a novel, and had a really great time doing that. And basically got the novel, once I had the screenplay reorganized and I'd done the outline for what I wanted to do in the novel, the first draft of this book just took about 4 weeks. So I really just jammed through it. I was very excited to write it, and did one revision, and other than that, pretty much it's what you get in the book. Yeah.
So why demon possession? What was what were the influences to lead you to potentially the darkest avenue of what could have happened at that orphanage?
Yeah, right. So, I don't really think of it as demon possession. I think of demon possession as a complete takeover of the body and spirit and mind, whereas In this book, it's more of like I said earlier, it's sort of an infestation. It's the kids are infected in a way, and their worst impulses are amplified, and their decision making is turned horribly violent. And but they always know what they're doing. They know the decisions they're making, and that was something that was really important to me, because this book is about the kids. It's about the conflicts that these kids go through in their own individually. You know, what's right, what's wrong, what do I want from this life, what am I willing to take from this life, and so some of the kids being infested and some of the kids not being infested leads to some difficult situations. But yeah, so I don't really think of it so much as a possession novel as I do about as a novel where these children are given, for lack of a better word, are given incredible agency to do all the things that maybe they would normally not have done, and in a very terrifying, aggressive, violent way. Yeah.
So, Boys in the Valley is loaded with a ton of religious iconography, mostly Catholicism. Did you grow up Catholic, or what baggage did that come with? And because growing up Southern Baptist, if I were to write anything like this, I know I would be pulling from personal experience. But if not, where did you research?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up Baptist, I guess. But it was really more, the religious stuff was really more of a means to an end. I wasn't in my head to try and make any sort of statement about religion or the practice of religion or Catholicism. It's really just, it's one of those things where it's like, well, if you got demons, then you got to have, right, the other side. And it happens to be at a Catholic orphanage, so there's priests. And Peter, who is the main protagonist, he is being groomed for priesthood. So one of the decisions that he is dealing with is, do I want to become a priest and serve God and stay at this orphanage for the rest of my life and take care of these kids who he loves very much, or does he want what the world can offer? And it's complicated by the fact that in the book, Peter is introduced to Grace, who lives on the local farm where they get some of their supplies that they're not allowed to or not able to cultivate themselves, and so that relationship throws a whole wrench into the which way do I go, coming of age kind of conflict. And then on top of that, when things get really horrific and the supernatural happens and the violence occurs, then that decision becomes even more amplified, because now it's not just about him and his life, it's also about the kids that he's trying to protect, and what's the best way to do that. So kind of, there's a lot of layers to what he decides to do, why he decides to do it. And there's also a very important conflict with this character, because I wanted the decisions that he was making in the book to be his decisions and not based on anything other than his own character and his own sense of right and wrong and responsibility. So when he does things that are extraordinary in the sense of humanity, in a very human way, it's because that's what he wants, that's what he decided to do. So Peter's got a very complicated kind of situation going on for a 15-year-old boy, but he's thrown into some bad situations. But to answer your question more directly, the religion thing is really just a means to an end. If the book took place, on a farm, they'd be hacking each other up with like saws. But in this case,
waiting for the sequel now.
It's more crucifixes and what have you. Yeah.
So as you were writing it, I think for anybody who has started it, if you haven't started it, this book scared the ever living out of me both times that I've read it. And I was curious, and I'm sure everybody else is curious, were there any parts of the book, no spoilers, that creeped you out where you had to stop writing it, or that were too difficult?
No. No.
All right, next question.
No, I mean there are some scenes that were very exciting for me to write because they were very scary scenes, and a couple scenes. Sometimes when you're coming up with a book, or when you're organizing a book in your head or thinking about it, sometimes you think of a scene first, and you're like, I want to write that. And there are authors who I've spoken with on my podcast who talk about that, where like they almost have like 2 or 3 scenes, and then the rest is like tying it all together. So there's a couple scenes in the book that are really, really scary for me, and also really exciting because I'm like, oh, this is a really scary moment, and I can't wait to write about it. I'd say less so scared. When I write, I'm a big fan of my characters. I get very invested in my characters. I really come to feel a lot of affection for my characters, good and bad. So when I get emotional sometimes when writing about the things that happen to them, because it's really never good, but it's very rarely good, right? So sometimes that's hard for me as a writer, because I don't necessarily want things to go wrong for some of my guys or gals, and inevitably they kind of always do, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's some stuff that happens in the book, guys. So leading into that, which character in Boys in the Valley was your favorite to write?
So like I said, I really like conflicted characters. All my books and stories, for the most part, at least I try to have characters that are very human, that are very gray. That you have bad guys that are doing things that are like, well, that's not, that's kind of interesting because it's not really the worst thing in the world, and maybe it's even a good thing. And then you have good guys who don't always make the best decisions, or maybe they act a little selfishly, or whatever. So I try not to have it be too tropey, and I like characters with a lot of conflict. So in this book in particular, there's 30 kids in this story, and all of them are in the story. So it was a lot to balance in that regard. And also the way I tell the story, so there's basically 4 points of view, I think there's 4, for the book. And the main one is Peter, and Peter's chapters are told in first person, and then the rest of the chapters are all told in third person. And so I really wanted Peter to be your guide as you read the book. I wanted him to be the one who's taking your hand and going, okay, let's go, and let's see where this goes. And I wanted his motivation and his background and all that stuff to be something that the reader was intimately familiar with. The secondary protagonist is named David. And David, for me, was probably the most interesting character to write because, like I said earlier, the evil infestation amplifies what the kids are already kind of thinking they want to do, and it's sort of like taking the chains off in a way. But David ends up being, this is a spoiler, David ends up kind of siding with the good kids, if you want to call them that. But David really hates the orphanage, and he really hates the priest, and some bad things have happened to him in this orphanage, and he doesn't even fully understand why he's not on the other side, and he doesn't even disagree with what's going on, but he does disagree with the way it's going on, and there are moments in the book where he's talking to Peter, and they're having a conversation, and he's talking about how conflicted he is, and how he doesn't understand why he doesn't really understand why he does act the way he does and why he makes the decision he makes. So he was a really fascinating character for me to write. And on my second pass through the book, I actually fleshed out a lot more of his inner psychology because I was so kind of captured with it. That said, there's a character in the book named Brother Johnson who was probably my favorite character to write because he's all over the map and you never really know what he's going to do next. And when I was writing the book, I wasn't 100% sure what he was going to do next. And so he was a really fun character for me to dig into. And a lot of people have expressed to me who have finished the book that he's one of their favorite characters, if not in the book, not only in the book, but in other books they have read as well, because he just kind of jumps off the page, I think. So he was fun to write.
Moving on to more general questions. You open Boys in the Valley with a quote from one of, dare I say, the best albums of all time. If you are not familiar and haven't opened your copy that is in front of you, it's from My Chemical Romance, The Black Parade. What is your go-to music listening experience or playlist? Walk me through that.
Okay, so when I write, I can't write to music that has words, that has lyrics. It's very distracting for me. When I'm writing, I'm very, very focused and very immersed. And if I hear like random words hitting my brain from next door, it's way too distracting. So I like listening to soundtracks. I like listening to instrumental music. I listen to 9 Inch Nails has this series of albums where it's all their music, but it's just the instrumental. So it's called Ghosts. I listen to that a lot of times when I'm writing. I'll listen to anything from Rachmaninoff to Mozart to Beethoven, depending on kind of what I'm writing. When I wrote this book, I pretty much wrote the entire book to the Dunkirk soundtrack. So if you've ever listened to Dunkirk, that soundtrack is awesome. And what's his face? Hans Zimmer, right? He's got the way he orchestrates or whatever, writes music, is he does layers, and he does hidden layers within his music, layers that you don't quote unquote hear. And so there's all this kind of weird silence and layered. One thing about Dunkirk that's interesting to this point is, and I'm not a music guy, so I'm going to butcher this, but basically the soundtrack, there's one of the songs where it's the whole song is slowly growing and toward a crescendo. It's getting more and more whatever, but it never crescendos. It just kind of keeps going and going forever. So it's really intense to listen to. And when I was writing this book, I was listening to it pretty much nonstop. So that was, and sometimes when I write a book or even a story, there will be a soundtrack that will get me in that right place. And once I establish that place, I live there. Like I put in the exact same music when I sit down because it gets me right there where I need to be, or I pick up right where I left off. And then very rarely I'll like switch it up. If I'm writing a scene that's really horrific or action-packed or violent or whatever, I'll put on like the Evil Dead soundtrack or something, and I'll like just to get in the mood, right? And but yeah, but I do always listen to music. I can't write in silence, and I can't write the lyrics. When I edit, I can write the lyrics. I can edit the lyrics, but I can't write.
So, from listening, so if you don't know, this man has a podcast that everybody, one that's in Horror Book Club or anybody that likes the horror genre should check out. It is called The Dark Word. It's available anywhere you get your podcasts, wherever podcasts are sold. And it's 24 episodes, and it is anybody from Ramsey Campbell to Stephen Graham Jones, Eric LaRocca, Sadie Hartman, Katrina Ward. I mean, just so Josh Mallerman. Yeah, I mean, some of like the quintessential like 70s and 80s horror greats to the, like we just read Things Have Gotten Worse, one of the more modern, incredible voices in horror. So check that out. You mentioned it earlier, I wanted to make sure you got your plug there.
Yeah, especially if you're a writer, it's all about writing. So it's about the profession of writing and publishing. So if you're a new writer or you want to be a writer or you know a writer, it's basically the podcast that I wish was around, a decade ago, where we talk about how to be a professional writer, what the publishing world is like, what contracts are like, what options are like, what everyone from S.A. Cosby to Joe Lansdale to Chuck Wendick to Paul Tremblay talking about how they write every day and what their modus operandi is or whatever. So if you're a writer, I think it's a really helpful podcast. Yeah.
So I feel like every podcast in the world, when people interview anybody, they ask you what was your first foray into horror. And I'm not going to ask you that because I think everybody asks that. What was the most recent film, book, anything horror related that you consumed that affected you enough to where you were like, that is like where the genre is going or what I want to do, or affected your writing?
Yeah, so interestingly, I'm not really a horror guy in the sense that
all right guys, go pack up and go home.
A lot of horror writers are like really into horror, right? Like they have the Halloween decorations up in their house 24 hours, 24. And I'm not really that guy. I don't watch a ton of horror movies. I don't watch slashers. I read horror because it's kind of my job, and there are authors that I like. I will say that I'll use your question. I'll bend it a little bit and just say who I would recommend. I think like Laird Barron to me is probably a generational voice in horror that everybody needs to read. He is just a phenomenal writer who does things with prose that I've never seen before or since, and he can get you to a very dark place without anything actually happening in the story, and you're just already like terrified. And I like Paul Tremblay does really experimental stuff, so I dig reading him. Josh Mellerman writes. I like the way he writes because I like the speed he tells a story in a way. I mean, he's just very different. Like he has a very unique voice. Paul's a unique voice. Laird is an amazingly unique voice. So I'm always really excited when I read people who are doing something that I haven't seen before. And no offense to New York Times bestsellers who are putting out a book every 6 months, but there's only like so many. It's a little dull to me to read another.
Take that, Stephen King.
Well, no, not Stephen King. Not Stephen King.
No, he had very kind words for Boys in the Valley.
He did, yeah. But I never wanted to be one of those guys who is just putting out like the next horror story, the next horror story, the next horror story, the next horror story. Like my next book is science fiction, and I have a children's book out, and I have another children's book that I'm going to be writing, and then I have a couple more horror books that are. I have a thriller that's being shopped right now that's sort of more speculative than horror, and then I have another horror book that's coming out. So after that, down a couple years from now. But so I do. Horror is my home, but I have a really wide, diverse series of interests, and that I both like to read about and write about. So I'm a big science fiction guy. I'm a big fantasy guy. I like a lot of the modern lit that's being written. But I don't know if there's anything I can say I've read or seen recently that I was like really blown away by that I can recall right now. But those are at least generally speaking the kind of writers I like reading. Yeah.
So when you say children's book, how different of a children's book is it than Boys in the Valley, which I think loosely could be defined as a children's book?
It could be loosely. Yeah. So. No. My children's book is about a little girl who finds a flower in her garden, and she gives it to a little boy in her dream, and they all live happily ever after. So it's not like this. And then I have another book that I want to write called The Belfry Miracle, which is about a bat. So he saves like a mission in Peru. So they're pretty different stories, but I was listening to a Stephen King podcast the other day when we were driving back from Oregon,
and the new Talking Scared.
The Talking Scared podcast interview,
So
and Uncle Steve said something really fascinating in that podcast, which was that he said, "I never sit down to write a horror story. It just kind of always works out that way, but I'm always thinking about the story first and the characters, and then because when my compass points north, it points toward horror, and I'm just a dark guy or whatever. And I think I'm the same way, but but I enjoy this. I enjoy storytelling, and I enjoy the characters, and I enjoy creating a really good story that will impact you emotionally and viscerally and give you something that hopefully will scar your brain a little bit. And then the horror stuff is just, it's a kind of just frosting on top of that cake in my mind. And I love writing the horror genre because, like with science fiction, there are boundaries to a degree. With fantasy, there are boundaries to a degree. And with horror, there are no boundaries. You can write whatever you want. It's all like, okay, you can have a giant cosmic spider at the end of your book, and it's fine. Like, it's totally like, yep, that makes sense. And like I have, and I give this, this, I mention this a lot, but which is that like in horror, in a horror story, you can have the little kid open the closet door, and there can be nothing in the closet, or there could be a dead body in the closet, or there could be a monster in the closet coming at your, tooth and fur and nails, or there could be like a portal to another dimension, and it's all okay. It all works. It's all horror. So that's why I personally really love horror, because I don't have to worry about being restricted. I can write whatever my imagination plugs into that story that serves the story, and I'm not confined. So that's why I personally really like horror, and I love scaring people. For those two reasons.
So if you love scaring people, what scares you? Obviously, writing Boys in the Valley didn't hit that for you. So what tips the scale?
So I don't know. I don't like. I have night terrors sometimes. My wife is here somewhere. So sometimes I'll just have really bad nightmares, and they're really weird, and they always shake me up pretty good, but they're never the same. So I don't know if it's ever any one thing. I don't love. I'm not a big fan of the dark, generally speaking. I don't really like complete darkness.
Any big dark stands out there?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of being like in a void. So
To each their own.
right, but yeah, no. So nothing really like spider. It's not like I don't really have anything. One thing where I point to and say this is like something I'm always terrified of. I don't like mushrooms, like just that. But that's more of an eating thing. So no, nothing. Nothing much really worries me. And the thing about writing horror is when you come up with something that's really scary, like I kind of said earlier, it's less scary and it's more exciting because you're like, oh, this is going to be so scary. I'm so excited to write it, and so it's more like fun. Like the more I think it's going to be scary for you guys, the more excited and the more fun I have writing it. So it's never really something that like worries me.
Okay, I have one more question before we open it to the floor. So, fair warning for anybody out there.
Oh, and do you want me to do reading first?
Yeah, we're gonna do that after
Okay.
the floor.
Oh, okay.
If that's okay.
Yep.
You're the boss. So, tell me about the difference that you've experienced now going from traditionally indie, smaller press to now, if I'm correct, this is your first Big Five?
Yeah.
With Tor Nightfire.
Yeah. So experiences between indie and big presses, you mean?
Yeah.
On the surface, there's really not that much of a difference. I mean, for me as a writer, it's really the biggest difference between an indie press and a major press, a Big Five press, is distribution. They get the books out to way more bookstores than any indie press really can. They just have those relationships. They have the big distributors they work with. It's hard for an indie press to have a really big distributor because they just don't have enough volume. So that's really the biggest difference. Money being kind of the second biggest difference, but even that, you'd be surprised. It's not really always that much variance between those two. So that's really But as a writer, the experience has been pretty much the same. I like writing for indie presses to a degree because I have a little bit more control over the book cover. I tend to work more closely with the indie presses as far as like how we're going to marketing or what ideas we have to promote the book. Whereas with Big Fives, you're kind of on your own, and they sort of they kind of do their thing, and I kind of do my thing, and it's so. But they're supportive. But but as a writer, there's really not a whole lot of difference. They both have their pros and cons. But I like having the Big Five presses because I like my book being available everywhere. Orbit is the U.S. publisher or the U.K. publisher, so it's available all over U.K. Commonwealth countries, and Macmillan's done a great job getting the book out to bookstores in the U.S. So that's the biggest difference. I mean, being practical about it. Yeah.
And I'm just going to plug for one of those other books that for everybody that has been reading and enjoying Boys in the Valley, go check out Gothic that he put out through Cemetery Dance, which I would say rivals how scary this book is.
Yeah, it's a different kind of horror, but yeah.
But put that on your radar. With that.
And Child Alone with Strangers.
Child Alone with Strangers is also very good.
Which
I
is
would
sort
say,
of the book that I always tell people to please go read, because if you like Boys in the Valley or you like big 600-page horror books that have strong crime influences, that book's a lot of fun. I'm a big fan of that book. So, if you want a big doorstop horror crime book, Child Alone with Strangers is a fun one to read.
I have not read one that you've put out that I was like, don't go check it out.
Working
So
on
to
it.
be fair,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, I'll have to read that the Bat Saving the Mission. Maybe that'll be the one that doesn't do it for me. With that, does anyone out there in the audience have a question for the man of the hour? It's okay if you don't.
I have one.
Yeah.
I don't need the mic. So you seem to take writing really seriously as a craft and a skill. Do you have any advice for people who would like to start trying to write horror, or even more generally for people who don't feel comfortable writing but have stories to tell and want to get into it? Do you have any advice for them?
For writing horror specifically, and also if you have stories to tell but aren't a big writer.
Oh, yeah, or just in general.
Well, yeah, I mean, for me, it's all about, well, to be a professional writer, it's all about persistence. You have to be willing to take a lot of rejection. You have to be willing to have a lot of people tell you they hate you and your work every day of your life. In public forums that are retweeted, and then, but so it's tough, and you have to kind of keep going. I mean, writing is probably the singularly most intensely negative profession you can have, because editors say no to you. Everyone's reviewing your book, is giving you positive or negative reviews. Like publishers say no to you, so like it's a lot of rejection, and you have to really love it, and so. There's a big gap between being a writer and wanting to be like a professional writer. But as far as advice for writing a horror, no, I mean, I think the most important writing advice besides persistence I could give, or perseverance, maybe a better way to put it, is have a voice. There's really no such thing as an original story in a lot of ways, but there's a way that you would tell that story that nobody else can tell it in that way. So I think what publishers and editors really love is original voices, unique voices, and everyone has a unique voice. So but sometimes they're like, oh, well, I have to write like Stephen King because he sells a lot of books, or I have to write like whoever because they're popular, or this is the new trend, or whatever that is, and that's never going to get you anywhere. So I would just say, use your own voice, write the way you want to write it, and whether it's just for fun or for publishing or whatever, I mean, just try and write, when you can. I'm not one of those guys that's going to say, well, if you don't write every day, you're not a writer. Sorry. I'm more of the write when you can. People have kids, people have jobs, people go on vacation, people get sick. Like, just write when you can what you want. And if it's something that starts to take form and you're like, hey, you know what, this could be a short story, or hey, maybe this could be a novel, or maybe this could be a screenplay, or whatever, a poem, or whatever it is, then keep at it and finish it. Whatever that takes. If it takes 6 months, if it takes a year, finish what you start, and it's very gratifying. I'll also say this about writing is the hardest part of writing anything is starting, and writing those first couple pages is always tough. Even if you're a professional writer who has big 5 deals like me, I hate starting a new story because you're trying to find that tone, you're trying to find that kind of groove. What is the story? How am I going to tell this story? And so the first couple pages or few pages of a book or story are always the most awkward, where you're really kind of fighting your way through it. But if you fight your way through it and you find that groove, you can come back and fix what you've already done later. But just keep going forward, and finish what you start. And I think that's the best advice I can give.
Thanks.
Anyone else?
I have one. So for this book specifically, did you ever start writing a character and you're like, oh yeah, this guy is definitely gonna die a horrible death? Because I had thoughts.
In this
when you
book in
killed certain
particular?
people. And I was like, oh yeah, he's definitely gonna die a horrible death because he sucks.
Oh, because he sucks?
Yeah.
Oh no,
but,
I definitely have characters where I'm like, oh, he's gonna die.
Yeah.
But I know that ahead of
your
time.
characters are great, but it's just like, oh, I hope that guy just.
No, as a matter of
dies
fact,
the best.
I'm kind of the opposite. I sort of like when people read, people start reading this book and they'll be like, I look on my social media page, I'm like, I can't wait till Father Poole gets it. You know what I mean? And I'm like, well, no, maybe.
Who's to say?
So sometimes it's fun not to have the villains get it, get what's due. But most times they totally get what's due. Yeah. There's degrees of that. There's a story I wrote called Alter, and which is being currently being. Well, I don't want to say it's currently being adapted, but it's in the process of being adapted to a feature, and with the studio and a director. So I'm very excited. And they, but there's it's a short story, so I can spoil it. So one guy gets away, basically. One bad guy gets away in that story. At the end of the story, you don't really know what happens to him. So I wrote a sequel to that story where I talk about what happens to that guy, and it's horrible. So, like it's you guys don't, yeah, like it's really bad. Even for me, I was like, oh my god, this is so bad. But so sometimes it's fun to give those guys their comeuppance. Yeah. So that was one where it's called The Fate of Nero. In The Fate of Nero, I was very much coming at it like this is a pure hate-fueled, fire-burning revenge tale, and he it was 9,000 words of this guy really getting what was coming to him.
You love to see it.
And the whole book takes place in a bathtub, so the whole story takes place in a bathtub.
Wow.
Anybody else before?
Yeah.
Kenneth?
So we talk a lot in Horror Book Club about sometimes we don't know when to be scared in the book. It's really easy on film to kind of know, oh, I'm supposed to be scared right now. So with like writing horror, do you have any tips for like maybe how to deliver the cue of scaredness to readers, like as a writer?
Like to give you the heads up, this part's scary.
Yeah.
First of all, I just totally noticed my mic was off this whole time. But hopefully you guys heard me okay.
Yeah.
Now it's on, right? Okay,
The
cool.
art of illusion.
Yeah, I project, it's cool. Queuing up the reader for a scary scene. No, I think it's better if you don't know it's coming. I think it's always funner if you're taken off guard, that something really comes out of left field a little bit. That's my preferred way to scare someone or to shock someone to a degree. But the other, to answer your question a different way, I would say that sometimes, so again, just using Alter as an example, Alter takes place at a community swimming pool. And the first half of that story is about this family going to the community swimming pool on a hot summer day, and it's all everything's fine. But when you read that story, you're like, oh, this is going to end horribly. And you don't know why, but you know, not because I'm a horror writer, but just because you know, because of the way I'm writing it, the words I use, the phrasing I use, I just, little hints here and there that things aren't 100% right. And so I think for me, it's that seeding, slowly seeding it, getting you kind of amped up a little bit. And then when the doors of horror open, you're kind of like, you're already at that peak anticipation level, hopefully. So I do that a little bit in this book with some scenes that I won't get into, but where I try and I start kind of ramping things up a little bit and getting you more on edge, and so that when it hits, you're kind of, you're sort of ready for it, but you weren't really sure what you were ready for. So hopefully it's this right. And the other thing I do. Just this is kind of a little bit of a side note to that, but I like very much working with the mechanics of storytelling. So, for example, in my novel *Child Alone with Strangers*, which is about a little boy who was kidnapped, the first, I think, like 100 pages or so are told in past tense, and then once Henry is kidnapped, the rest from that moment on, the story is present tense. And it's pretty subtle if you're not looking for it, but for me, it's a way I'm just kind of pressing that gas pedal down a little bit. It's saying like, okay, here we go, we're speeding things up, and things are going to start going a little faster now.
So what you're saying is you have another children's novel?
No. The protagonist of *Child and Only Strangers* is a 9-year-old boy named Henry, so that's why.
I think a case can be made.
Stephen King did say in that same podcast that he said basically he considers like half his books YA books because like Institute and
He just says 4-letter words all
But right, yeah, but he uses 4-letter words all the time, so therefore they're not YA books. But and kids are interesting to write about because they are these incredible creatures. They have these wide open minds and they're tough and they don't know enough to do that. What they're doing is a really bad idea, but they also respond to trauma differently. When really crazy stuff happens in a horror novel, if you're a 45-year-old male coming out of a bar and you see a spaceship, you're going to have one kind of reaction. I think if you're an 8-year-old kid walking out of a building and you see a spaceship, you're going to have a really different reaction, like, oh, cool, or whatever. So I think that's something interesting about kids, and they're so smart, and they're so tough, and they're so brave, but they're also kind of dumb, right? Because they're kids. So I mean, meaning ignorant of the world is where I wanted to phrase
You
that.
heard it here, kids. Kids are
So,
dumb.
headline: Fracassi, those kids are dumb. Yeah, put that on social media.
More at 11.
Yeah, and canceled. And so I think they're interesting as characters to write about, and those experiences of them coming of age. And Boys in the Valley is an example of that, because all 30 kids are unique, and all the main kids have very unique conflicts and very unique psychological makeups, and they're very emotionally different, and they respond differently to different things. So creating all these little minds was really fun and fascinating, and especially when you put them in a true horror situation, which no kid should ever be put into. The way they respond to that situation is especially interesting to me as a writer.
Morgan, do we have any time for more floor questions, or do we need to go to the
We
read?
can take another question.
Anybody else on the floor for a question?
Yeah.
More of a random question, but going back to the story you said was the inspiration for this book, you mentioned it was from Pennsylvania, and I'm from Pennsylvania, and I'd never heard of this, so I was just curious if you knew where in Pennsylvania it was from.
Oh God, no, I know. I'm sorry. This was like a decade ago, but I think it's. I'm sure if you were to Google it, like rural Pennsylvania orphans disappear, it might come up, or Google Boys in the Valley, maybe. But no, I don't remember. I think in this book I have it. In this book I set the orphanage. I want to say outside of Chester, right? So Chester's like the coastal town, right? I think, kind of, sort of, right? So. At least toward the coast, and I think this is set like 3 hours by horse anyway, away from Chester. So that's kind of the area where this takes place. But yeah, no, it's all. Most of it's just. It's all just me making it up.
Incredible. It's what writers do. Molly, did you have a question?
Oh, yeah. So I didn't know this movie was going to be made into, like, that you wrote it as a screenplay, obviously it's been set down, but if it were going to be made into a movie and you, like, absolutely had to cast Nicolas Cage as a character, who would it be and why?
So this book actually is being made into a movie, or I don't know, or a TV show. I don't know which, and it may actually never actually happen. But there is a director, there is a screenplay, there is producers attached. So but everything's on hold right now because of the strike. So nothing's happening. But this is it's been adapted as both a TV show and as feature. So it's kind of being shopped as potentially both, but we don't know what's going to happen, and no one may end up making it, but hopefully they will. But Nicolas Cage, who I love, I think he would be Brother Johnson in this book.
Ooh.
Yeah, because I think he's got that range, and I think he would be absolutely terrifying as Brother Johnson. There's one scene in particular in this book where if that was Nicolas Cage, I would not be able to watch it. I'd be so scared.
Could you imagine if we were able to get Mike Flanagan on the line for this with Nicolas Cage attached, and just what would come?
Yeah, that would be cool. Yeah, I actually tried to get Flanagan interested in this one, but he had some other stuff going on at the time.
He had already done one Catholicism commentary,
Yeah.
and he said nah.
Yeah, he's probably had enough of it. Yeah.
He said no demons, only vampires. Anybody else on the floor, or are we ready to go to?
Yep.
All right.
I just listened to Shiloh, finished that up, absolutely loved it.
Thank you, man.
What was your inspiration for that? And please tell me, do you plan on writing any more, like following up?
Yeah, so Shiloh is a novella that I wrote. It's a Civil War horror story. One of those. And the whole story takes place during the Battle of Shiloh. So it's about these two brothers who are in the Confederate Army, and they, there's demons and green blood, blah blah blah. So it's a really fun story. It was a really hard story to write because of the amount of research I had to put into it. Because I really wanted it to be factually correct, and I read Ambrose Bierce, the author, was actually at the Battle of Shiloh and wrote extensively about the Battle of Shiloh. He was there on the north side of things. And I read a lot of, for that book in particular, besides the historical and the battle stuff, I also read a lot of first person memoirs, or whatever you want to call them, diaries. So people from men who fought in that battle, because I wanted to get sort of the language right, the dialogue, that kind of stuff. I had to research what the kids, or what the men say, what they don't say, what words were around, what words weren't around. And the thing about writing historical fiction, especially historical war fiction, is you don't really fully realize how much research you have to do until you're writing the book. Because like you'll have a scene where like someone will be wounded and they have to like rip off the shirt that he's wearing, and you're like, what kind of underwear did they wear? So you research that. And if someone has to cut something, like, what did they use to cut stuff in 1862? Was it scissors? Was it shears? Like, what were they doing? So little things like that, because you want to get the details right, but you also don't want to like overdo the details. So this is a historical piece, but I really was focused on the dialogue being correct, but I didn't really want to overdo a lot of the historical facts. But you don't really need to, because it's such an isolated story. But there was a good amount of research that went into this to make sure it was all accurate, what was happening. And to answer your actual question, no direct follow-up to my novella Shiloh, but I did just finish a book, a novel called Serafina, which is all takes place during the Civil War period, 1862, 1863, I think, in the whole, from beginning to end. And that's like a big 100,000 word book about these brothers who go AWOL from the war and run across a house in the woods. I'm sure it'll be fine. And there's a woman and her child who live there, and it's what happens to the brothers in this house that they find while they're AWOL trying to get back home.
Now this one's for free, but if you do want to do a sequel to Shiloh and you want to keep with the kids book theme, you could do Shiloh 2 and make it about the kids book with the dog, but make it a horror.
So let me tell you something about Amazon. So I got an Amazon 1-star review for Shiloh.
I knew nothing about this
and
before I
the
asked
entire
this.
goddamn review was, I hated this movie. So, you know.
Is the review still up for us to go look at?
Yeah, it's still.
Iconic.
Dude, if I could take that stuff down, man, I had no power.
But then you wouldn't have this anecdote at this book signing in Bentonville, Arkansas.
So Boys in the Valley has, I think, like 120 something Amazon reviews. All of them are 4 and 5 star for the most part. There's one 1-star review, and that 1-star review is about the packaging. They were upset about the packaging. And
Thanks,
I'm like,
Jeff.
And I'm like, or the printer did no, I think there was a printer error, right? Printer error, yeah. And I'm like, this is in no way is going to affect that printer. There's no negative impact at all on the person that you were actually upset with. But thanks for the 1-star.
So
Don't get me started, you guys. Don't get me going on Goodreads. That's next.
I think this is the natural off ramp to have Philip take a cool down and read us the prologue,
Yeah. So
which gets a 5 out of 5 stars. From
Yeah.
me.
So I don't want to spoil anything. So I just read the prologue when I do my readings, which is the only setup I'll give is that I mentioned Peter earlier. He's the main protagonist of the book. So this prologue takes place 6 years before Peter arrives at the orphanage. So it is when he is probably 9 years old, give or take. So I think if I remember correctly. So this is basically Peter pre-orphanage. Harris Valley, Pennsylvania, 1898, midnight. The muted thunder of wagon wheels wakes me from shallow sleep. Outside my darkened window, the clop and hard breath of horses. A rattling wagon pulls close to the house, then slows, then stops. Men's raised voices group together, then fall apart. Disappointment veiled by revelry and drink. I hear mother in the kitchen dividing my attention. I throw off the blanket and run barefoot to the window. Cold air pushes through thin glass, and I shiver. Father's inky silhouette stands in the narrow lane, one arm raised. He cries out, and now distant voices reply. His arm drops to his side. He turns toward the house and appears to stumble, then catch himself. The long black line of the rifle cradled in his arms points skyward. Pots clatter from the kitchen and I run to the door that separates my room from the living area. This includes a sitting space, a dining area, and kitchen. Our whole world is but 3 rooms and a pair of outhouses, a world held together by warped wooden planks and warmed by rusted black stove that eats coal faster than we can fill it. I'm lucky to have my own room, even if it's small. Though I'm little, I'm not able to take 3 large steps in any direction. Father says I'm a runt, but Mother says a 9-year-old boy has room to grow. I hope to get big, but not so big I can't fit in my room. I like it too much. I see more clearly now because Mother has lit the kitchen lanterns. There's enough space between my bedroom door and the frame to stick a finger, so light comes through easy, coats the dark walls, and disrupts the shadows in the corners and beneath my bed. Don't mess up the book. I step softly to the door. It wouldn't do for them to know I'm up, and put an eye to the gap. If I swivel my head, I can see the entire kitchen and the dining table, but not much else. I'm cold and nothing but long johns, but want to hear about the trip. Mother has the stove going, and I smell the warming onion soup she'd taken from the icebox. She puts on a kettle for coffee. Father slams the door and the house rattles. Mother wipes her hands on her apron in a way she does when she's upset, like she's wringing it dry. Father enters my field of vision, all beard and worn leather, a beat-to-hell Stetson wedged over black hair. He pulls out a chair, sits heavily. The rifle butt clunks against the floor, and he looks at the old Winchester as if willing it to speak. Nothing, Mother says. Nothing at all. Father waits for the gun to answer, but it stays silent. I'll have what's in that pot, sissy, and some coffee. It's heating, she says, stirring. She keeps her eye on the stove, off my father. You've been drinking. I inspect him more closely for signs of drunkenness, wondering what my mother sees that makes it apparent, but nothing stands out. He looks tired and wronged, but that's his natural state. Sheriff is shooting poachers, land's dry. Father shakes his head. He takes off the Stetson, sets it on the table. He still holds the rifle. I want to open the door and go to him, sit with him, and talk like men about the sheriff and the land. The kettle starts to whistle. What are we going to do, Jack? The garden can provide some, but we need meat. Winter's coming. Father runs a hand through his long hair. Please, he says, and I tremble at his voice as well as the cold. Shut up, sissy. Just shut up and bring me some coffee. I will my mother to stop, to leave him be. She knows what he's like. I close my eyes for a moment and silently pray. Then I watch. The kettle is screaming, and I know if I hadn't been awake already, I would be now. The house is filled with the high-pitched shriek of rushing steam. I see, Mother says. You go out with the boys for 2 days, drinking and who knows what else. Leave me and Peter here to starve. Just starve. She screams this last at him, and I see my father's face redden. His eyes close tight, then open wide. Shut your goddamn mouth, he yells, spit flying in the lantern like mist. Shut it, shut it, shut it. You're horrible, Jack. You'll wake Peter. Father slams his hand on the table, and Mother, realizing she's gone too far, pushed him too hard, quickly removes the kettle and pours coffee into a cup next to the stove. The reprieve of the kettle's whistle is luxurious. You're a disappointment, she says as she pours. How dare you swear in my house? Use the Lord's name in vain. He mumbles something. It sounds like that's enough, but I'm not certain of the words. I just know that he's upset. I've never seen him in such a state. His downcast face is stone, his eyes black pearls. Mother brings the coffee to the table, lips tight as a pulled drawstring. You are no husband, she says. You aren't even a man. He turns to retort just as she arrives with the cup. His elbow knocks it from her hand, and the hot coffee drops into his lap. Father screams in pain, leaps up. The chair clatters to the floor, and Mother backs away, hands raised in supplication. Apologies and terror spill from her mouth. Enough, he says. I watch his father with a practiced and casual movement raises the barrel of the rifle, and cocks the lever with a hideous smoothness. Mother holds up her hands. Oh, Lord Jesus! The eruption of the gun shatters the air. Mother jerks backward as if tugged by the hand of God. She hits the stove with such force that the door pops open and coals fly out in a shower of sparks like burning souls. A lantern on a nearby hook crashes to the ground and fiery oil splatters the floor and wall. Frail curtains catch the hot spray and burn. There's a moment where time stands still, and then Father is howling. Oh, sissy! He puts a dirty hand over his mouth as the room brightens. Oh, damn it, sissy! He kneels beside her and sobs. Wet heat runs down my leg, and I look down to see a puddle forming around my foot. When I raise my eyes, Father is once more seating himself at the table. One wall crawls with flame. Dark smoke rides the low ceiling like storm clouds. Father turns his head toward my door, and for a moment our eyes meet. I imagine how I must look to him, a sliver of sun, a bright probing eye in the dark, watching his sins. Father holds his eyes on me. I make a study of him. Wet eyes and mussed hair, straggled beard, a sweat-sheened face smeared in prancing red flames. He looks away, back to my mother. He doesn't turn toward me again. I want to cry out, to scream, to run to him. My teeth chatter. I begin to moan, and I can't stop. I can't move. I can't breathe. All I can do is watch. He slowly cocks the lever of the Winchester, the very one he taught me to shoot with that past summer, puts the grip between his knees and the barrel's lusterless tip beneath his chin. Something inside me comes awake, and at the last second I shut my eyes. This shot is duller than the first. Breathing fast and heavy, I pull open the door and stare boldly at the scene. For a moment, I see myself as a spectator, a thin shadow shaking before a fiery dragon, crotch-stained and whimpering. Before me is nothing but death and blood and smoke and flame. My whole world is fire. Kind of goes downhill from there.
He really knows how to write an uplifting tale.
Yeah.
All right, so here's Morgan with the weather.
Thank you so much, Adam, and thank you so much, Philip. Can we get another round of applause?